Sarah Miller had never planned to disappear, but somehow it had happened anyway. Not in the dramatic way people vanish into thin air, but in the slow, quiet way that creeps in over years. She was the kind of person the city forgot about, someone who moved through its veins, without making noise, without leaving footprints bold enough to be noticed. If you asked anyone at St. Francis Shelter Chapel about the cleaning lady, they might shrug. Some might remember she had brown hair, always tied back. Others might guess she was around 30, maybe older. But her name, few could say it. Fewer still had ever bothered to ask. Every evening at dusk, as the last volunteers left the soup kitchen and the chapel's heavy wooden doors swung shut against the winter cold, Sarah would arrive with her battered canvas tote. She would clock in without a word, change into a faded navy uniform in the small janitor's closet, and begin her rounds. Her world was bleach buckets, mops, soap that cracked her knuckles raw, and silence so deep that she could hear the chapel's old furnace sigh when the wind rattled the stained glass windows. Sarah didn't mind the silence. If anything, she clung to it. She liked how the shelter at night felt like a different world. No sermons, no bustling lines at the soup counter, no children crying or people arguing over who got the last blanket. Just the echo of her footsteps on the stone floor, the smell of pine cleaner, and old hymn books. Sometimes when the snow outside fell thick and heavy, she would pause beside the tall arched window behind the pulpit, look out at the street lamps glowing soft orange, and allow herself to believe she was part of something bigger, even if no one ever said her name aloud. Once Sarah had been someone else. Sarah Jean Miller, 20 years old, community college scholarship kid, studying computer science, working nights at a diner to pay rent, dreaming of transferring to a 4-year university. Back then she'd been loud in her own quiet way, smart, stubborn, the type who always raised her hand, who coded until dawn, who thought grit was enough to outrun life's storms. But grit didn't pay hospital bills when her mother's lungs failed. Grit didn't keep the lights on when her father's old debts showed up at the door. By 22, Sarah had quit school to care for her mother full-time. By 24, she was alone in the world, broke behind on rent, her brother gone into a tangle of trouble she'd stopped trying to untangle. Grit, she learned, meant very little without someone to notice you had it. So Sarah found work where work didn't care who you'd once dreamed of being. Cleaning jobs never asked for transcripts or resumes polished by pride. They asked for strong arms and a willingness to stay invisible. She did both well. She never missed a shift. She never asked for overtime, even when the hours piled up like snowdrifts outside the chapel's back door. The shelter's director, Father Paul, was kind enough in his distant way. He'd nod when they crossed paths during his late-night prayer walks, maybe ask about the heating, or if the floors had been salted against the ice. He always called her Miss Miller, like it was a title she'd earned. Sometimes he'd thank her when he noticed the chapel pews shining before Sunday Mass. But like everyone else, he never really looked at her. That was fine. Sarah preferred it that way. Most nights, Sarah finished her shift around 2 in the morning. She'd pack away her cleaning cart, tuck the mop back into the closet, and slip into her threadbare winter coat. Then she'd walk the 6 blocks to her studio apartment, a tiny box above a corner grocery, heat leaking through thin walls, refrigerator humming too loud at night. She'd lock the door, turn the kettle on, and sit at her small kitchen table sipping weak tea, staring at the cracked linoleum floor, until sleep felt possible. She never complained, not out loud. Maybe once or twice in the dark, she'd whisper her mother's name, wish her father had tried harder to stay clean, wonder if her brother might ever come home. But mostly she kept her thoughts neat and folded, the same way she stacked the clean blankets in the shelter's supply room. What she didn't expect, what she never imagined, was that her life would bend again, not because of the storms that always seemed to find her, but because of a boy no older than 12, who would slip in and out of the shelter's side door when he thought no one was watching. Sarah noticed him the first week of December, when the city's cold turned sharp enough to cut through the thickest jackets. He'd come late, too late for the free soup line, too late for the cots that filled up by 8 p.m. She found him curled up behind the row of folding chairs near the coat rack, his backpack clutched tight to his chest, a frayed blanket draped over his knees. She didn't wake him. She just cleaned around him, careful not to make a sound. The next night he was back, same corner, same posture, head down, shoulders hunched like he'd grown used to being small. Sarah wondered whose kid he was, if someone was waiting for him somewhere. But she didn't ask. Questions had teeth. Sometimes kindness didn't. When she finished scrubbing the floor, she left a packet of crackers and a paper cup of warm tea on the chair closest to him. In the morning when she came back to clock out, the cup was empty. The crackers gone. The blanket draped neatly over the chair back, as if to say thank you without saying anything at all. Sarah told herself it was nothing, just a gesture, a small thing. But the next night she brought half a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper, left it in the same place. Again, by morning, gone. The chapel's stained glass turned the hallway into a rainbow of flickering color when the streetlights hit just right. Sarah would stand in that light after she set down the food, watch the boy's small shoulders rise and fall with sleep, and wonder if he even dreamed anymore. She hoped he did. She never asked his name. She never told him hers. Some things she figured were best left quiet, like prayers, whispered in the back pew when the world felt too heavy to hold alone. In those early weeks, Sarah didn't know she was changing anything. She didn't know that a few crackers, a half sandwich, a cup of tea would matter so much to a boy the city had overlooked. She didn't know that one day, long after the snow melted and the chapel's candles had burned down to stubs, 4 black SUVs would pull up outside St. Francis Shelter Chapel and ask for her by name. She didn't know that being invisible didn't mean being unseen forever. But in the hush of the winter nights, as she wiped down pews and stacked hymnals, Sarah Miller, cleaning lady, quiet ghost of the chapel, fed hope into the hollow places, one small meal at a time. The first real snow of December came down in thick, stubborn flakes that clung to the chapel's iron gate and softened the hum of the city beyond its walls. Sarah Miller pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as she stepped off the bus that night, her breath trailing clouds into the bitter air. She paused by the gate, looking up at the old brick shelter, the stained glass dim behind locked doors. The wind carried the distant sounds of traffic, but here, in this patch of cracked sidewalk and flickering streetlight, the world felt still. Inside, the shelter's night was the same as always. The warmth was uneven. The front hallway near the soup kitchen stayed almost cozy, but the far corners of the chapel's back halls never quite shed the chill. Sarah shrugged off her coat, clocked in, and made her way to the small janitor's closet. She tugged on her faded navy smock, tied her hair back, and picked up her mop and bucket. There was comfort in the routine. Tonight, though, something was different. She was scrubbing down the tile near the back pews when she heard it, the faintest shift like fabric brushing old wood. She turned her head and caught the shape of him for the first time. Small shoulders, a backpack too big for his frame, sneakers damp from snow. He was curled in on himself, behind a row of folding chairs stacked against the wall. For a second, Sarah froze. He didn't move. She could see only his eyes, dark, wide, watchful. They flickered to her bucket, then back to her face. She wanted to say something. Ask if he was all right, if he was cold, if he needed help. But the words caught behind her teeth. She knew enough about fear to recognize it. Questions would only drive him deeper into the shadows. So she looked away first, giving him that small victory of pretend invisibility. She wrung out her mop, turned back to the floor, and kept scrubbing. When she finished the hallway an hour later, he was gone. The faint shape of him vanished into the night as silently as he'd come. Sarah stood staring at the spot, the mop handle dripping against her sleeve. She knew better than to think this place was empty once the lights went out. St. Francis was refuge for all kinds, men who'd lost jobs, mothers escaping bad hands, kids who didn't have anywhere else to wait out the cold. But this boy seemed different somehow, careful in the way only someone who'd learned the hard way that people notice weakness too easily. The next night she saw him again. This time he was sitting cross-legged beneath the coat rack near the back door, backpack at his feet, staring at the floor like it might tell him what to do next. Sarah pretended not to see him at first. She worked her way through the halls like always, sweeping near the old radiator, wiping down the smudges on the glass entry. But when she wheeled her cart closer, she paused beside the coat rack. He stiffened, his small hands tightening around the straps of his bag. Sarah crouched down, pretending to inspect a loose tile. "Hey," she said softly, her voice careful, low enough that it felt like a secret. He didn't answer, didn't look up. She stayed there a beat longer. Then Rose pushed her cart to the storage room. Inside the supply closet, she rummaged through her tote bag. She had half a peanut butter sandwich she hadn't eaten on her dinner break. Carefully, she wrapped it in a paper napkin, slipped it into a brown bag. When she stepped back into the hallway, he was still there. Same spot, same eyes watching her like he might bolt at any wrong move. Sarah didn't say a word this time. She set the bag on the floor near the corner of the coat rack, not too close to scare him, not so far that he'd think it was for someone else. Then she turned her back and walked away. 15 minutes later, she passed by again on her way to mop the back stairwell. The spot was empty. The bag was gone. Only a small piece of the napkin remained, folded neatly, tucked under the edge of the baseboard. That was how it started. Over the next week, Sarah fell into a ritual she didn't dare call kindness, not out loud. Each night she brought something small: a bag of crackers, a granola bar, an apple if she could afford one. She never offered it to him directly. She never spoke. She left it near where she knew he would be, then cleaned around him without looking too long, like he was another shadow the chapel walls had learned to keep. She didn't tell anyone. Not Father Paul, not the soup kitchen volunteers, not the older ladies who came in twice a week to polish the brass candlesticks and chat about neighborhood gossip. Sarah kept her secret folded small in her pocket, like the napkin scraps he always left behind, his way of saying thank you, she decided. Quiet gratitude in pieces too tiny for anyone else to see. Once she caught his eyes for longer than a second. She'd just placed a stale muffin left over from the shelter's breakfast donations near the folding chairs. When she turned, he was standing a few feet away, backpack hugged tight to his chest. His eyes met hers, wary but steady. He didn't speak, but he didn't hide either. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. A memory of her brother flickered through her mind, that same guarded look, the same stubborn pride that kept him hungry when there was food on the table, if only he'd asked. She wanted to say, "It's okay. It's not charity. It's just food." But she knew better. So she only nodded a small, careful nod and stepped back. The boy took the muffin. When she turned away, she felt his eyes linger on her a moment longer than before. One night, after the last hymn practice ended and the chapel was hushed again, Sarah found him asleep on one of the back pews. His arms were tucked under his thin jacket, his head resting against the old wood. The winter wind rattled the stained glass, and she thought about waking him, telling him to move to the shelter dorms. But she knew he wouldn't go. He wouldn't trust a bed surrounded by too many strangers. So instead she tiptoed to the linen closet, pulled out a spare blanket, and draped it gently over him. He stirred, half waking. She froze, heart pounding, as his eyes flickered open, just for a second. He looked at her, really looked, then pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and closed his eyes again. Sarah stood there for a long moment, watching the rise and fall of his breath. There were 100 questions on the tip of her tongue. What's your name? Who are you running from? Are you cold? Are you scared? But questions could scare him away. And for now, this was enough. This small piece of trust. This shared silence between a woman who had been invisible for so long and a boy who wanted nothing more than to stay unseen. Outside, snow kept falling. The city slept while Sarah swept the chapel's aisles and watched over a boy who reminded her too much of all the people she hadn't been able to save. She didn't know if this small ritual would make a difference. She only knew she couldn't stop. By the second week of December, Sarah's quiet routine had taken on a weight that both comforted and frightened her. Each night, as she stepped off the bus and made her way through the drifting snow to the chapel's back door, she wondered if tonight would be the night he wouldn't show up. But he always did, small, silent, a moving shadow who slipped in through the side entrance when he thought no one was looking. And every night Sarah found a way to leave something behind for him. Some nights it was half of her own dinner wrapped carefully in wax paper. Other nights it was a piece of fruit she'd managed to buy from the corner shop down the street, where the old shopkeeper knew her by name, but never asked why she only ever bought single apples or a single banana at a time. When her tips from the laundry service she did on weekends were enough, she'd slip a juice box or a small carton of chocolate milk into her tote bag, pretending for a moment that she was someone's mother packing a lunch for school. Sarah never asked where he went during the day. Sometimes she caught a glimpse of him through the stained glass if she stayed late enough sitting cross-legged on the frozen curb outside reading a battered paperback by the light of a street lamp. He was always reading something, she realized. It made her chest ache in a way she couldn't name. She wondered where he found the books. She wondered if he could even check them out with no address, no parent to sign a form. She started bringing old paperbacks from the charity box near the chapel's entrance. She left them on the same bench where she'd place his food. One morning she found one of those books open and resting on the pew where he'd been sleeping, a dog-eared page carefully marked with a piece of torn napkin. Inside the cover he'd scribbled 2 words in small, careful letters. "Thank you." It was the first thing he'd ever written to her. Sarah kept that book in her canvas tote from then on. She read it on her bus rides home, tracing his handwriting with her thumb, as if it might explain who he was or why it mattered so much that he kept coming back. People began to notice. Not the boy, no one else ever seemed to see him slip in or out like a ghost, but they noticed Sarah. The volunteers who handed out bread in the soup line whispered about how she sometimes slipped into the kitchen late, how she tucked leftover rolls into her bag or poured a bit of the extra soup into an old thermos she kept in her locker. No one said anything at first. After all, everyone took home scraps now and then, but rumors grew like weeds in the cracks of that old building. One night, as she was scrubbing the baseboards near the fellowship hall, Kathy, a volunteer who'd been with the shelter for nearly a decade, cornered her. Kathy's voice was not cruel, but it was edged with the tired harshness of someone who'd seen too many good intentions go nowhere. "Sarah, you know you can't just hand out food on your own," Kathy said, arms folded, apron dusted with flour from that night's bread rolls. "We're not running a personal pantry." Sarah kept her eyes on her bucket. "I'm not stealing," she said quietly. "I use my own money most nights. And if word gets out we've got people sneaking extra food, the board will ask questions." Kathy pressed. "These places run on trust. Donors like knowing every roll goes exactly where the paperwork says it does." Sarah didn't argue. She'd learned long ago that defending kindness too loudly only made people more suspicious. Instead, she nodded, squeezed out her mop, and went back to her scrubbing. But when Kathy turned away, Sarah felt the small shape of the wrapped sandwich in her pocket press against her side. She knew she would leave it anyway. She knew she couldn't stop. The boy never said a word. He never offered her his name or asked hers. But every night he came back, every night he accepted the small hidden kindness she left tucked in the shadows. And that was enough for Sarah. It was enough to know that for an hour or two in the dark hush of the chapel, someone wasn't hungry. Someone knew that even if the world outside forgot him, someone inside hadn't. Some nights she found other small signs he'd been there, a folded blanket draped carefully over the pew, a tiny scrap of paper with a new word written in block letters. Warm, safe, quiet. One night after she'd left him a cup of hot tea from her own thermos, she found the word home scribbled on a scrap of a hymnal page. She tucked that scrap into the pocket of her uniform, carried it with her, even when she wasn't sure why. Outside, the snow piled higher each night. The shelter's pipes creaked under the strain of the cold. Volunteers complained about drafts that slipped under the doors, no matter how many times they were weather-stripped. But Sarah never complained. She only worried about him out there when she couldn't watch him, about what might happen if he didn't slip through that side door one night. One evening, as she swept the front vestibule, she heard Father Paul speaking to the overnight staff. His voice carried through the old hallways. He was reminding them to watch for troublemakers, kids who slipped in just to steal, teenagers who snuck in drunk or high. Sarah felt her broom handle tighten under her palms. She wanted to step forward to tell him the boy wasn't trouble. But she didn't. Instead, she turned back to the vestibule, swept the grit from the entryway, and prayed under her breath that the boy wouldn't be noticed by the wrong eyes. By Christmas week, Sarah was spending more and more of her tips on small treats: an orange, a box of crackers with cheese, sometimes a small chocolate bar she'd hide in the fold of an old sweater she'd leave beside his backpack when he fell asleep. She knew it wasn't much. But she also knew what it felt like to have nothing, and then suddenly to have something. a small sweetness you didn't expect proof that someone saw you. One night, as she laid a small wrapped sandwich on the back pew where he slept, she caught him watching her with eyes wide open. He didn't flinch this time. He just stared at her, the shadows soft around his face. She wanted to say Merry Christmas, but her throat tightened instead. So she only smiled a small, careful smile and pressed the sandwich closer to him before she turned away. That night, as she gathered her cleaning supplies to leave, she found a folded scrap of paper tucked into the pocket of her mop cart. Written in the same block letters, "Thank you, Sarah." It was the first time he'd written her name. She stood there for a long moment in the echoing dark hallway staring at those words. She wondered how he knew her name. Then she thought about all the ways a boy like him learned things, listened when adults didn't realize they were speaking aloud. She pressed the paper to her chest. And for the first time in years, Sarah Miller, cleaning lady, invisible woman of the shelter chapel, felt seen too. By the end of December, the snow outside the chapel was no longer gentle but harsh, stacking high against the chain-link fence that wrapped the shelter yard. Sarah Miller tugged her coat tighter around her shoulders each night as she slipped in through the side door, her breath catching like smoke in the freezing air. Inside, she shed her layers, pulled her cleaning cart from the closet, and checked her small stash, a sandwich, a piece of fruit, a leftover pastry wrapped in parchment. Always something, always tucked inside her canvas tote so no one could see. But people saw more than she realized. Whispers had started, small, careless comments passed between the overnight volunteers when they thought she wasn't listening. Sarah heard them anyway. The clatter of her mop bucket couldn't drown out the sharp edges of words like stealing, misusing donations, breaking the rules. She pretended she didn't hear, but her stomach twisted every time she found the same pair of eyes following her down the hallway. Kathy's eyes, or Miss Eleanor's, the elderly parishioner who folded linens for Sunday service. One bitter Thursday evening, Sarah was restocking paper towels in the supply room when Kathy slipped in behind her. The door clicked shut and Sarah froze, a half-open box of soap in her hands. "You have a minute?" Kathy asked. She didn't wait for an answer. She crossed her arms, leaned her back against the shelves. Her breath smelled faintly of stale coffee and peppermint lozenges. "Father Paul asked me to talk to you." Sarah turned, hugging the box against her chest. About what? Kathy's mouth pulled into a thin line. "About the food." Sarah's throat went dry. "What food? Don't play dumb." Kathy's voice was sharp, but not cruel. Just tired, worn by years of seeing people bend small kindness into excuses. The leftovers, the pantry crackers, the apples that vanish from the snack baskets, the tea bags, the cups. "You think we don't notice?" Sarah shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "It's just a few things." "It's not yours," Kathy said. "It's the shelter's. Donors expect everything accounted for. You know how tight the books are. We're scraping by to keep the heat on as it is." Sarah could feel her heartbeat in her temples. She looked down at her shoes. They were cheap canvas sneakers, the soles patched with duct tape where they'd split last winter. She hated how they made her feel small. "It's not for me." "Then who?" Kathy's voice softened just a notch. She wanted Sarah to trust her. Sarah could hear it, that edge of sympathy that made things worse, not better. "If there's someone who needs help, you know there's a process. Intake forms, bed lists, breakfast lines. You can't run your own side charity out of the supply closet." Sarah looked up, eyes steady. "It's not charity. It's just a sandwich. A sandwich every night," Kathy snapped. "A sandwich, an apple, a muffin. It adds up. And if someone complains, if the board sees the numbers don't match, you think they'll care that you meant well?" Sarah hugged the box tighter. She wanted to tell Kathy about the boy, about his small thank you notes, about how he curled up like a ghost behind the pews, about how he reminded her that she could still do something that mattered. But she knew what would happen if she did. They'd find him. They'd force him into the system, wrap him in rules he didn't trust. They'd take away the tiny piece of freedom he'd carved out between the chapel's shadows. So Sarah said nothing. "I'll stop," she whispered. Kathy sighed, pushing off the shelf. "Good. That's all Father Paul wants. He says you're good at your job. Don't make trouble where there doesn't need to be any." When she was gone, Sarah set the soap down and sank onto the supply room stool. She buried her face in her hands. Her palms smelled faintly of bleach. Underneath the chemical sting, she could still smell the faint sweetness of the sandwich she'd tucked into her tote that evening, a sandwich she knew she'd leave anyway. That night she waited until the chapel was empty. Lights dimmed, the doors bolted for curfew. Then she tiptoed down the hall, the sandwich wrapped tight in wax paper, an apple balanced on top. She placed them on the pew where she'd last seen the boy sleeping. She knew he'd find it. He always did. But her hands shook as she walked away. It didn't take long for word to spread beyond Kathy. A volunteer snapped a photo of the empty wrappers tucked under the pew. Someone else posted it online with a caption that made Sarah's cheeks burn when she read it later, hunched over the cracked screen of her phone. "Cleaning lady steals from the church to feed strays." The comments multiplied, fast, sharp, self-righteous voices hidden behind cartoon avatars and half-names. If people need help, they should ask for it properly. Rules exist for a reason. Probably pocketing food for herself. This is why donations can't be trusted. Sarah read every word. She shouldn't have, but she did. Each one cut deeper than she wanted to admit. By morning, the post had been shared by someone who lived 2 blocks from the shelter. By noon, it had been reposted by a neighborhood group that loved nothing more than sniffing out other people's small missteps. By the time she arrived for her shift that night, Father Paul was waiting for her near the coat rack, his arms folded over his black winter coat. His eyes were soft, but his jaw was tight. "Miss Miller," he said quietly, "can we talk?" He led her into his small office near the back of the shelter, a room that smelled of old hymnals and half-burned candles. He gestured for her to sit, then closed the door gently behind him. "I know you've heard the rumors," he began. Sarah looked at her hands folded in her lap. She nodded once. "I know your heart is good," Father Paul said. "I've seen you here late, keeping this place cleaner than it has any right to be. I know you care about the people who come through our doors. But you can't do this alone. You can't decide who gets fed and who doesn't without telling someone." Sarah wanted to explain. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't deciding anything, that she was just giving what she could where she could. But the words tangled in her throat. She stared at the small wooden cross that hung on the wall behind his desk. "Miss Miller," Father Paul continued softer, "now the board will ask questions if we have donations unaccounted for. I can cover you this time. But if you keep doing it, if this becomes bigger than you, it'll put the shelter at risk. We can't afford that." He paused, waiting for her to lift her eyes. When she didn't, he sighed. "Promise me you'll stop." Sarah swallowed. She felt the lie in her mouth before she spoke it. "I promise." Father Paul nodded. He didn't look angry, only tired, the same tired she felt in her bones every time she left this place before dawn, watching the city wake up around her. He reached for a folder on his desk, then stopped. "Go home, Miss Miller. Get some rest." Sarah left the office, the hallways dim and cold around her. She stepped into the supply closet, found the sandwich she'd hidden behind the broom. She looked at it for a long time, wax paper folded neatly, the crusts trimmed just the way she knew he liked. Then she slipped it into her coat pocket and stepped out into the chapel's quiet dark, hoping he was still waiting, hoping he hadn't given up on her the way everyone else had. The snow came down harder than anyone expected that week. The city plows worked through the night, pushing thick drifts to the curb, but the sidewalks around St. Francis Shelter Chapel stayed slick with black ice and hidden patches that caught even careful feet. Sarah Miller arrived for her shift on a Tuesday evening, the wind slicing through the gaps in her second-hand coat. She tugged her scarf up to her chin and paused at the side entrance, squinting into the dark. Some nights, if she came early enough, she would catch a glimpse of him, a small shape near the chain-link fence, a shadow leaning against the back steps, waiting for her to disappear inside before slipping through the side door. But tonight, there was nothing, just snow and the soft rattle of the chapel's old sign swinging in the wind. Inside, she changed into her faded uniform as usual. She filled her mop bucket at the laundry sink, tied her hair back, and checked the small shelf behind the supply room door where she always hid the food. Tonight she had half a ham sandwich wrapped in wax paper, an orange, and a chocolate bar she'd saved from her last trip to the discount store. She'd been planning this one a small surprise, a small Christmas treat. She slipped the package into her tote bag and pushed her cart down the hall. 9 o'clock came and went. The back pew stayed empty. She cleaned the vestibule, the front aisles, the rows of folding chairs near the coat rack. She paused by the spot where he sometimes sat, knees pulled tight to his chest, backpack pressed like a shield against his ribs. No trace, no scrap of paper, no thank you. Nothing. By 11, she told herself he'd found another warm spot, maybe slipped into the dorms when she wasn't looking, maybe found a corner in the basement where the overnight volunteers wouldn't bother him. Maybe. But she knew better. He didn't trust beds lined up in rows. He didn't trust too many eyes on him at once. When her shift ended near 2, Sarah stood by the back exit, peering out at the snow-covered street. It was quiet in the way only deep winter could be. No footsteps, no distant hum of cars, just the hush of the city sleeping under a blanket too heavy to shake off. She tucked the sandwich and chocolate bar into her tote bag, zipped it shut, and whispered into the cold air as if he might hear her anyway. "Be safe, kid." The next night, she waited again. She cleaned slower, listening for the small sounds she'd learned to notice: a rustle of paper, the quiet scrape of a backpack zipper, the softest footfalls on the old wooden floorboards. But there was only silence. The pew where he sometimes slept was empty. The side door near the coat rack stayed shut tight against the wind. No small blanket tucked neatly behind the folding chairs. No empty cup. No sign of him at all. Sarah left the sandwich again anyway. She set it gently on the pew, tucked the chocolate bar beside it. When she came back at dawn, it was still there, untouched. Snow clung to her boots as she stood over it, her breath fogging in the half-light that filtered through the stained glass. She wanted to cry, but the tears stayed hidden the way they always did. She slipped the sandwich back into her tote, wrapped the chocolate bar inside her scarf, and walked home in the icy dawn, her shoulders hunched against a cold that seemed to live under her skin now. By the 5th day, people noticed. Kathy found her wiping down the pews and said softly, "He's gone, huh?" There was no judgment in her voice that time, just the tired certainty of someone who had seen too many strays come and go. They always disappear, sooner or later. Sarah didn't answer. She just dipped her rag into the bucket and scrubbed harder at a stain that had been there for years. She still brought the food. She couldn't stop. Each night, she wrapped a sandwich, a piece of fruit, if she had it, a small sweet when she could. She placed it in the same spot near the pew where he had once curled his knees under the blanket she'd left. And every morning it was still there, a quiet reminder that hope could be stubborn but not always enough. The shelter volunteers began to murmur again. Some thought she was wasting food that could feed the real lines, those who came in when the chapel bells rang, the ones who signed their names on intake forms and said thank you where people could hear it. Father Paul watched her carefully when they crossed paths, his eyes heavy with the kind of sympathy Sarah hated. He wanted her to let it go, to stop clinging to the idea that one small ghost of a boy could be saved by sandwiches and stale muffins. But she couldn't. She had failed too many promises in her life already: her father, her mother, her brother, whose postcards stopped coming years ago. She could not fail this, even if he was gone, even if he never came back. On the 10th day without him, Sarah didn't sleep when she got home. She made tea and sat at her tiny kitchen table staring at the folded scraps he'd left her. Thank you. Warm. Safe. Home. Her fingers traced each word like a prayer. She wanted to believe he'd found somewhere better. A real home, a real bed, someone who asked his name without scaring him off. But deep down, she knew the streets didn't work like that. Boys like him didn't just find warm beds because they disappeared from a back pew. They found cold corners, darker alleys, doors that stayed locked. She found herself whispering, "Please be okay," into the quiet of her empty apartment. When her shift came again that night, she wrapped another sandwich anyway. She placed it on the pew. She whispered goodnight to the shadows that didn't answer back. Kathy found her near closing time wiping down the donation bins. "Sarah, you can't keep doing this." Sarah didn't look up. "It's just a sandwich." Kathy sighed, her breath turning to mist in the cold hall. "You're going to break your own heart." Sarah wanted to say it was already broken, that it had been for years, that maybe she needed this small crack of hope to remind her it could still feel something. Instead, she just said, "I know." The snow piled high that weekend, drifting against the chapel doors until Father Paul had to ask 3 volunteers to shovel a path so the Sunday families could come in without slipping. Sarah stood at the back of the nave that morning, hidden behind the last pew, watching the families kneel in rows, watching mothers smooth their daughters' braids, watching fathers whisper hymns into their children's ears. She wondered if the boy ever sat in a church with his parents, if he ever had someone fix his collar, wipe the snow from his boots, promise him the world was safer than it looked outside the stained glass. She stood there until the choir's final note faded into the hush of the chapel walls. Then she slipped into the hallway, pulled her coat tight around her shoulders, and stepped into the cold alone. That night she found the pew empty again. The sandwich still there, the chocolate bar untouched. Sarah sank onto the wooden bench, the cold seeping through her uniform. She folded her hands over her knees and whispered into the empty air, "Where are you?" No one answered. Only the chapel's old pipes groaned in the walls. Somewhere outside, the wind rattled the stained glass with a soft, insistent plea, like a question only she could hear. She left the food behind anyway. She locked the chapel door behind her and trudged home through snow that came up to her ankles, wondering how a boy so small could leave a hole so large inside a heart she'd thought had forgotten how to break. It was early January when the sky above the city shifted from heavy snow to an icy drizzle that turned every sidewalk into a mirror of slush and danger. Sarah Miller trudged through the back gate of St. Francis Shelter Chapel, her boots leaving shallow prints that melted and vanished within minutes. She had stopped expecting him. Every night for weeks now, she still left the small offerings, a sandwich, an apple, sometimes just a muffin wrapped in wax paper. But she did it out of habit, not hope. Hope, she decided, was too heavy to carry when you already had so much weight in your pockets. That Tuesday night began like the rest. She clocked in, tied on her faded smock, and swept the long corridor between the main hall and the fellowship room. The pews stood empty except for the echo of memories she tried not to hold too tightly. By midnight, she was mopping the vestibule when Kathy poked her head in to say Father Paul wanted a word. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, braced for another gentle reminder to let it go. But when she stepped into the small office at the back of the shelter, Father Paul wasn't alone. 2 strangers sat opposite his desk. They were both men, tall, broad-shouldered, under dark winter coats, dusted with the damp chill of the night. One of them wore a sharp-pressed suit beneath his overcoat, so clean and so out of place in this building, where even the best clothes always smelled faintly of disinfectant and cheap laundry soap. The other looked more casual, but spoke first. "Miss Miller?" he asked, standing to shake her hand. Sarah nodded, her palms clammy, even before she touched his warm, steady grip. "Yes." Father Paul cleared his throat. "Sarah, these gentlemen are with Child Welfare and the local precinct. They asked to speak with you." Sarah's heart did something sharp in her chest. Did something happen? The man in the suit opened a thin folder and slid it toward her. "We think you may know a boy. About 10, 11 years old. Small for his age, dark hair, usually wearing an old gray coat and a black backpack. Comes and goes around this neighborhood. You seen him?" Sarah's mouth went dry. She glanced at Father Paul, who avoided her eyes. I don't know," she said carefully. "Lots of kids come through here. Sometimes they line up for food." The second man leaned forward. "This one never came in for food. Not officially. But people say he was here. People say you were seen leaving food in places no one else could reach." Sarah's fingers tightened around the back of the chair. "Is he in trouble?" Neither man answered right away. The suited one sighed, flipping the folder shut. "His name is Jacob Carter. He's been missing for nearly 6 weeks. His mother filed a report, but..." She's been unstable for a long time. The father's not in the picture. This kid's been living wherever he can shelter stairwells, basements. Last confirmed sighting was 2 weeks ago, not far from here. Sarah's stomach twisted. Jacob. She'd never dared to ask. Never imagined his name might taste like this, real and raw on her tongue. Is he okay? That's what we're trying to find out, the second man said. He studied her face. People like him fall through cracks, Miss Miller. You know that better than most. You were feeding him, weren't you? Sarah's eyes dropped to her hands, knuckles white against the wooden chair back. She felt Father Paul watching her, his breath a soft hush in the warm office. She wanted to lie. She wanted to keep the boy's ghost safe in her silence. But there was no more hiding. The rumors, the wrappers, the scraps of thank yous. She couldn't bury them anymore. Yes, she whispered. I gave him food. Just something small. He wouldn't take anything if I offered. So I left it. That's all. The man in the suit leaned back, the old chair creaking. When did you last see him? Sarah's voice cracked. Before Christmas. He was always so careful. I thought he'd come back. I thought maybe he'd found somewhere warmer. Someone who'd help him better than I could. The second man's expression softened just a little. You did help him, more than most people would. Father Paul cleared his throat again, his hands folded in prayer, even though he said nothing. The man in the suit stood nodding toward the door. We'd like you to come outside, Miss Miller. Sarah's brows furrowed. Outside. Just come with us, the second man said, his voice surprisingly gentle. You need to see this. The night air slapped her cheeks raw as she stepped out of the back door into the courtyard behind the chapel. She expected a police car, maybe an ambulance. But what she saw instead nearly buckled her knees. 4 black SUVs lined the narrow alley that fed into the back lot. They gleamed under the streetlights, engines idling softly. On the far side of the open gate, uniformed officers stood at attention. But they weren't police. Not exactly. Their coats bore the dark green patches of the local National Guard unit. Beside them, 2 men in plain clothes held radios at their chests, scanning the dark street beyond. What is this? Sarah breathed. Before anyone could answer, the back door of the lead SUV swung open. A man stepped out, older, broad-shouldered, dressed in a heavy wool coat that did little to hide the rows of service ribbons on his chest. He wore no hat, though his breath fogged in the cold. He looked like a man who didn't mind being recognized. He walked straight toward Sarah. He didn't need directions. He knew exactly who she was. You're Sarah Miller, he said. His voice was deep, not unkind. Cleaning lady, right? Sarah nodded, her words caught somewhere deep behind her ribs. Yes. The man's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the edge of relief fighting its way through years of practiced control. I'm Major Carter, Jacob's uncle. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Jacob. He told me about you, Major Carter said. When he was found. Sarah's vision blurred. He's alive. The major nodded. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the SUV. And there he was, the small shape of him half hidden behind the open door. Jacob stepped down slowly, his backpack slung over one narrow shoulder, his old gray coat still zipped to the chin. His eyes found Sarah's in the yellow wash of the streetlight, still wide, still careful but not quite so haunted. Hey, Miss Sarah, he whispered. Sarah couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then she dropped to one knee on the wet asphalt, arms open, before she realized what she was doing. Jacob crossed the few feet between them and wrapped himself around her shoulders. He smelled like cold air and the soft, bitter soap shelters used for everything. But beneath that, he smelled like relief. Like a second chance. Like a promise she didn't know she'd been waiting to hear. Behind them, Major Carter cleared his throat. He turned to Father Paul, who had stepped into the courtyard, his collar turned up against the wind. You got a good one here, Father, Major Carter said, nodding at Sarah. This boy survived out here because she kept him fed. She kept him believing not everyone would look the other way. Father Paul's eyes shone. He's safe now. Major Carter nodded. He's coming home with me. We're family. Took a while to untangle the mess with the mother. She's in treatment now. Jacob's coming with me to the base until we figure the rest out. Sarah's hands stayed on Jacob's shoulders, grounding him, grounding herself. She looked into his face, pale, thin, but brighter now under the guard lights. You found your way home, she whispered. Jacob's chin trembled. Because you didn't let me go hungry. Behind them, the engines of the SUVs hummed softly, warmth pushing against the bitter January air. Major Carter stepped closer, handing Sarah a small envelope. She took it with numb fingers. It's just a letter, he said. From Jacob. And from me, too. To say thank you. You did more than feed him, Miss Miller. You made him believe someone still cared. Sarah clutched the envelope to her chest. She wanted to speak, but her voice was nothing but breath and cold night air. Jacob squeezed her hand. I wrote you something, too. They stayed like that for a moment longer. A boy, a woman, a family. Neither of them expected. Then Major Carter gently touched Jacob's shoulder. Come on, son. Jacob hesitated, glancing at Sarah one last time. Then he pressed something small and warm into her palm, a folded piece of notebook paper with his careful block letters. She didn't unfold it right away. She didn't need to. She already knew what it would say. When the SUVs pulled away, the street fell silent again. The chapel lights glowed behind Sarah as she stood alone in the courtyard, the envelope pressed tight against her coat. She unfolded the scrap of paper with shaking fingers. In the middle, in Jacob's shy, careful print, were 3 words. Thank you, Sarah. The courtyard behind St. Francis Shelter was empty long after the SUVs rolled away. The only sound was the soft hiss of ice melting from the chapel roof, dripping into the narrow gutters. Sarah Miller stood in that hush with the boy's folded note pressed to her chest. For a long time she didn't move. Her breath formed small clouds in the air, dissolving almost as quickly as they appeared. Inside the hallway, lights buzzed softly. Father Paul stood by the back door, his coat collar pulled up around his neck. He didn't say anything at first, just waited, watching Sarah like he was seeing her for the first time. You did good, Sarah, he said, when she finally stepped inside, her boots squeaking on the salt-dusted tiles. Sarah smiled faintly, the kind of tired, quiet smile that came when you had no energy left to pretend. I didn't do much. Father Paul shook his head. You did enough. They stood there together for a moment in the silence that churches seem to keep even when empty. Sarah's mind drifted to the scraps of thank yous tucked in her apron pocket, to the nights she'd spent worrying if she was foolish to believe a sandwich could save a life, to the way Jacob had looked at her that night like he'd known all along she'd be there even if the rest of the world forgot. Word spread quickly. Not on purpose, Sarah would never have told a soul herself, but that's how small places worked. Kathy found out first when she came in early to start the bread line. She found Sarah wiping down the pews like she did every morning, a thin line of dawn slipping through the stained glass. So it was him, huh? Kathy asked, voice softer than usual. Sarah didn't look up. His name is Jacob. Kathy rested a warm hand on Sarah's shoulder, a rare gesture for a woman who so rarely touched anyone. You did a good thing. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. Word trickled out from there. Someone heard it from Father Paul. Someone else mentioned it at the corner store. The small neighborhood around St. Francis carried the story in pockets. How the cleaning lady fed a boy no one saw. How she kept him warm, kept him alive, made sure he knew he mattered when no one else did. By the end of the month, a quiet shift started to take hold in the chapel. People dropped off small donations, packs of juice boxes, extra bread, warm socks still in their wrappers. A local bakery started sending its unsold loaves in a big paper bag every Sunday evening, no questions asked. One night, a teacher from the school 3 blocks away stopped Sarah as she was mopping the hallway. You're Miss Miller, right? The teacher asked. She looked nervous, tugging her gloves off, one finger at a time. Sarah nodded. My class made these. She handed Sarah a small box wrapped in bright paper. Inside were knitted scarves and hats, each one child-sized, each tagged with a scribbled name. For kids like Jacob, the teacher said quietly. In case there's another one. Sarah held the box close to her chest. Thank you, she said, her voice almost a whisper. 2 weeks later, Father Paul pulled her aside again. She braced herself for another gentle talk about rules, about boundaries, about how the world worked. Instead, he led her into the small office and closed the door behind him. On the desk sat an envelope, this one thicker than the note Jacob had given her, marked with the neat insignia of the local guard unit. They sent this for you, Father, Paul said, nudging it forward. Sarah opened it slowly. Inside was a letter from Major Carter, typed and signed in blue ink. The words blurred a little as she read words about gratitude, about how the shelter's small acts had given a lost boy more than just bread. There was a check inside, too, enough to cover weeks of food, enough to make sure the next hungry child didn't have to slip through the shadows to find kindness. At the bottom, in a neat, careful hand that wasn't the Major's, was a small line. Thank you for feeding me when no one else did. Jacob. Sarah folded the letter into her pocket, her fingers trembling just a little. She wondered where he was that morning. If he'd woken up warm. If he'd found something to read by the window the way he used to under the street lamp outside the chapel. By spring, the chapel's small pantry was never empty again. People still whispered sometimes about how one cleaning lady could make so much noise without saying a word, about how a sandwich and an apple had reminded an entire block what kindness looked like. Sarah didn't mind the whispers anymore. She knew now what it felt like to be seen, and what it meant to see someone else when they needed it most. Every night before she clocked out, she still checked the pew where Jacob used to sleep, not because she expected him to come back. Major Carter's last letter said he was enrolled in school now, living on the base, asking for extra books every week. But Sarah kept a small blanket folded under the pew anyway, just in case. Just to remind herself that some places should always feel safe enough for a boy to sleep when he had nowhere else to go. Late one night, Sarah paused by the chapel door on her way home. The city beyond the stained glass was waking up for spring, all wet sidewalks and budding branches trembling under the streetlights. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out Jacob's first scrap of paper. Thank you. The edges were soft now, worn thin from being unfolded and folded again. She slipped it back into her pocket and stepped into the cold air. Ahead of her, the street stretched wide and quiet. Her boots splashed through a shallow puddle at the curb, the ripples fading almost instantly. Some people would forget the boy's name in a week, in a month. Most would never know Sarah's. But somewhere a boy named Jacob Carter would grow up remembering that someone made him feel full when the world tried to empty him out. And Sarah would carry that with her, proof that sometimes the smallest kindness could echo through years, through locked doors and cold pews and silent sleeping cities. She paused at the end of the block, the chapel behind her. For a moment she let herself smile, soft, tired, but true. A cleaning lady, they called her. A ghost in the halls. The quiet woman who mopped the floors and emptied the bins when no one looked. But tonight she knew the truth. Tonight she knew she'd done something good enough to last.